Hello everyone. In this video I would like to talk about how to set up Apple's Macintosh OS, OS 10, so that we are able to use it to do PHP development. For starters, what I have here on my desktop is a file called firstpage.php that is a PHP script that I've created. If we actually take a look at the code, this is what it actually looks like. You can see that for the most part it is made up of regular old HTML code, with the exception of one line in the body, which is a PHP echo statement that says welcome to PHP, that is enclosed inside PHP tags. Based on what we're seeing here, what I would expect to see when we pull this up in a web browser is in the content of the page, the body of the page, I would see my level 1 header that says hello, and then below that, output from the PHP code, we should see the words welcome to PHP. If I actually try to pull that up in my browser though, let's see what we actually get. I'm going to bring up my browser here. I'm going to drag my file into the browser. And this is what actually ends up showing up, not at all what I actually expected or what I actually wanted. What we're seeing here is the code itself, which is obviously not desirable. The problem that we're running into here is that the web browser does not know what a PHP file is. So lacking any specific knowledge about what it's supposed to do with a file of this type, the browser is simply treating it as a text file and showing us the actual text of the file itself. It's not attempting to render or execute anything. If we want to fix this problem, there's a few things that we need to do. The first thing is that we need to be able to actually access this page through a web server so that we can request it. And the reason we want to be able to request it through a web server is so that we can then also have PHP get in on the mix. Essentially, we want the web server to be configured so that whenever a PHP page is requested, it will hand it off to a PHP module, which, knowing PHP, will then be able to execute the PHP code. The end result that we would want then would be all of the code that we see here converted to plain HTML, which could then be given to my browser so that the browser would be able to render it and display it the way I expect. So let's take a look at what we need to do in order to make that happen. For starters, can I access this page through a web server? Well, here in my browser, if I go up to the address bar and I make a request to localhost, that's this computer, it comes back right now and tells me Safari cannot connect to the server. The reason for that is that I don't currently have a web server running. That is not that big of a problem on OS 10 though, because OS 10 comes with a built-in web server. If I were to jump over to a terminal, if you're unfamiliar with the terminal in OS 10, you should be able to find it under Utilities in your Applications folder. Once I'm actually here in a terminal, I can type sudo, which simply means I'm going to execute a command as the administrator. Then I'm going to type Apache CTL, that's Apache control, Apache being the name of the built-in web server that we have available. Then I'm going to type the word start. When I hit enter, it may at that point ask you for your password. If I then come back over to my web browser and repeat my request to localhost, now it comes up and says, most appropriately, it works. So I now have a running web server. So at that point, can I then request my PHP page? Well, almost. I can certainly make a request for my PHP page. The problem is the PHP page is currently on my desktop and the web server does not know to look on the desktop of my computer for files that are requested. So what I really need to do is I need to move the file over to the folder, what we would call the web root or the document root of the web server, which is the folder where the web server knows to look for files that are being requested. So I'm going to open a Finder window here. I'm going to go up to the Go menu and I'm going to choose the option Go to Folder. Once I've selected Go to Folder, I can then type in here /library/web-server/documents. That is what we call a path, and that will take this Finder window to the proper folder where the web server expects for requestable files to be located. So I'm going to go ahead and click Go. It takes me over to that folder. This is a folder that's normally hidden from OS X users. It's something that I suppose Apple assumes that most everyday users don't need to access, so they don't make it especially easy to find. But using that Go trick, as you can see, it's not that difficult to get there. Your documents folder may very well be empty or not have far fewer files in it than mine currently does. Obviously, I use mine pretty regularly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my file from my desktop, my first page file, and I'm simply going to move it over to that folder. Again, there's a chance at that point that OS X may ask you for your password at that point. Now that my server is running and my file is in the proper location, if I go back over to my web browser, if I come up to the address bar and add the name of my file, firstpage.php, onto the end of it, you can see we're now seeing pretty much the same thing we saw before. The difference, though, is that previously, when I drug the file directly into the browser, we were just looking at the file as it was. Now we're actually requesting the file through a web server, which is the first step that we needed to accomplish. Obviously, the file's still not being rendered the way that it should be, and the reason for that is that PHP is not actually kicking in and executing the code yet, but that's the next thing we have to look at. So in order to get PHP now working, what I'll need to do is I'll need to jump back over to my terminal again, and in my terminal I need to actually edit my Apache configuration file. So I'm going to type sudo, again executing a command as the administrator. Then I'm going to type nano, which is a command line text editor. Then the actual file that I want to edit is private/etc/apache2/httpd.conf. When I hit the enter key, then it pulls that file up so that I can edit it. And what I'm going to do here in the file is I'm going to hit Control W to search, and I'm going to search for PHP. That should take me straight to a line that says something along the lines of pound load module php5_module followed by a path to a library. What I need to do to activate PHP with my copy of Apache is simply remove that pound sign from the beginning of the line. That pound sign was essentially turning that line into a comment, meaning that it was being ignored. If I remove that pound sign, the line will no longer be ignored, so the next time the Apache web server starts up, it will load the PHP5 module. Let me go ahead and save this file and exit from Nano. I'm going to hit Control X to do that. It asks, do I want to save my file? I'm going to type a Y for yes. Then I'm just going to hit the enter key to tell it to save it under the same file name. And at that point, I've updated my configuration file. Now to restart Apache, I'm going to type sudo apache-ctl restart. I'll hit enter. The Apache web server is restarted, and at that point, the PHP module should be ready to run. So let me go ahead and pull my web browser back up. If I hit refresh at that point to send the request for my PHP script again, now it works like a charm. What I want to do at that point is look at the code that was actually downloaded to my web browser from my web server. To do that, I'm going to hit Command-Option-U. That'll pull up my developer tools here over on the side. And you can see what we have here that was actually downloaded from the web server to the browser. What the browser is actually rendering is essentially what we saw previously in my text editor, essentially the code that I wrote, except with one very important difference. That difference is that the PHP tags and the echo statement that previously were around the welcome to PHP, those are gone. The reason they are gone is, of course, because when I requested this page, the request went to the web server. The web server recognized that I was requesting a PHP file. It then asked the PHP module for help. The PHP module then looked through my file, found that PHP code, and ran it, executed it. The output from that PHP code then is exactly what we see here, welcome to PHP. That output was then spliced back into the regular HTML code, and all of it together is what the web server then returned to my browser. This is important because, of course, our web browser doesn't speak PHP code. All it really knows is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that is what I needed to have returned from my web server, and that is exactly what I got. So everything is working great at that point. We are set up at this point to be able to do some PHP development here on our Macs. One last thing I might mention about this, though, is that it isn't always the most convenient thing to have to do all of our development directly in that documents folder. That documents folder will become very crowded very quickly if every single PHP file we create goes directly into that folder. So a lot of times it's very handy to be able to create subfolders. As an example of that, here under my documents folder, you can see I have a subfolder called sample. If I were to take my first page PHP script and were to drag it over to that sample folder, if I then return back to my web browser and again hit refresh, at this point I now get an error. It's telling me it doesn't know a file called firstpage.php. The reason for that is the URL localhost/firstpage.php is saying to find the firstpage.php file directly in that documents folder, which corresponds to what we're calling here localhost. That file is no longer in that location because I moved it into the sample folder. If I come up to my address bar and I put localhost/sample/firstpage, then at that point, when I hit enter, the file goes back to working again. We're again telling it to properly find that file. Using that basic idea, that means that I'll be able to write as many different PHP files as I'd like. I can split them up into different folders based on what project they're a part of or what examples we're working on, and I can keep my documents folder from becoming unmanageable.